The stale air of the server room clung to Ethan like a second shirt, thick with the whirring symphony of 1,000 hard drives. 22 years old, fresh out of college and eager to prove himself, his youthful optimism was slowly withering under the fluorescent lights. Lines of code crawled across the monitor, blurring before his tired eyes. Another all-nighter beckoned, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the flickering promise of a near-impossible deadline. This was becoming a familiar routine, a cruel initiation into the corporate world. Mr. Elm, his boss, was a man whose smile seemed permanently glued to the out to lunch setting. He thrived on deadlines that defied logic, and Ethan, the newest member of the IT team, was his favorite target. Ethan saw Mr. Elm's grin not as a sign of encouragement, but as a barracuda circling its prey. Mr. Elm saw Ethan's youthful energy as an endless well of stamina, a resource to be ruthlessly exploited. Tonight was no exception. Ethan had inherited the dregs of Mr. Elm's latest project, a complex data migration involving a vital medical trial. The potential loss of this data sent a jolt of nervous energy through him. It was like Mr. Elm was dangling a life raft over a piranha tank, expecting Ethan to swim across. Just as his brain was about to short-circuit entirely, a deafening crack split the air. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the room into an inky blackness. Panic clawed at Ethan's throat. The emergency backup lights sputtered on, casting an eerie red glow on the rows of blinking servers. A low hum filled the room, rising in pitch until it became a bone-jarring whine. The floor lurched beneath his feet, the metallic tang of ozone filling his nostrils. Then, with a blinding flash of white light, the world dissolved into chaos. Ethan blinked, disoriented. Gone were the sterile walls and flickering lights. Instead, he found himself bathed in the warm glow of a setting sun. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, carpeted with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. A winding path, lined with ancient oaks, beckoned him forward. The air, surprisingly, hummed not with electricity, but with the sweet chorus of unseen birds. It was a world devoid of electronics, a stark contrast to the one he left behind. Ethan landed hard, the breath knocked out of his lungs. A gritty dust filled his eyes, and the stench of manure assaulted his nostrils. He coughed, sputtering, and forced his eyes open. He found himself sprawled on a wooden plank sidewalk, the midday sun beating down mercilessly. Gaudy signs creaked in the wind above him, their painted lettering advertising saloons and general stores. Confused, he sat up, taking in the scene around him. A tumbleweed rolled past, its skeletal form a stark contrast to the bustling crowd of cowboys and frontiersmen milling about the dusty street. A saloon piano pounded out a raucous tune, competing with the shouts of drunken patrons spilling out onto the sidewalk. This wasn't his cubicle. This wasn't Silicon Valley. A knot of dread tightened in Ethan's stomach. Where the hell was he? He stood up, unsteadily, and brushed the dust off his suit. His thumb idly traced the smooth, cold surface of his smartphone, now nothing more than a useless brick. He tried to remember how he got here. The last thing he could recall was the flash of light, the server room disappearing in a blinding flash, and then, nothing. A raspy voice shattered Ethan's growing panic. "Well, howdy there, Pilgrim. Looks like you done yourself a right proper tumble." Ethan looked up to see a weathered cowpoke leaning against a hitching post, a toothpick jutting from the corner of his mouth. Wrinkles fanned out from his squinting eyes, and a wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face. Despite the midday heat, the man wore a heavy duster that looked like it had seen its fair share of dusty trails. Ethan scrambled to his feet, brushing the dirt off his jeans. Hi there. He stammered, his mind racing. How do you explain to a cowboy from a dusty frontier town that you're a programmer who just got sucked out of your server room? The cowboy chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Spit it out, son. Don't keep a feller in suspense. You lost, or worse. Ethan hesitated. Lost didn't even begin to describe it. I don't know where I am, he finally admitted, feeling a flush creep up his neck. The cowboy's eyebrows shot up. Don't know where you are? Well, that's a fine howdy-do. You in desolation, son? Leastways, that's what folks call this sorry excuse for a town. Desolation. The name fit, Ethan thought, glancing around at the ramshackle buildings lining the dusty street. Most looked like they were one good sneeze away from collapsing entirely. Saloon doors swung open and shut, drunken laughter spilling out like overflowing buckets. A lone tumbleweed skittered past, a dusty reminder of the harshness of this unforgiving land. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream shattered the midday lull. Ethan whipped his head around to see a young woman, her dress askew, being accosted by two burly cowboys in front of a general store. One of them had a hand clamped over her mouth, the other rifling through her purse. Before Ethan could think twice, his body reacted on autopilot. Years of playing Wild West video games, a guilty pleasure he kept hidden from his coding buddies, kicked in. He lunged for the holster strapped to his hip, a holster that wasn't there. Panic surged through him. He didn't even have a gun. But then, as if conjured by his desperate need, a glint of metal caught his eye. Hooked on the back of the cowboy he'd been talking to hung a pair of holsters, each containing a well-worn revolver. In a move that surprised even himself, Ethan snatched the holsters and strapped them on, the leather surprisingly familiar beneath his fingers. He hefted the revolvers, their weight strangely comforting in his hands. The cowboys harassing the woman hadn't noticed Ethan's sudden transformation. With a deep breath, Ethan drew the revolvers, aiming for the center of their backs. The world seemed to slow down. The shouts of the crowd faded into the background. All that remained was the sight of the two cowboys, their obliviousness a stark contrast to the cold certainty in his grip. "Let her go," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Just let her walk away. That's all I'm asking." The words seemed to jolt the two men out of their stupor. They whirled around, eyes wide with fear and recognition. It was the accent, Ethan realized. They hadn't expected him to sound like one of them. The two men let go of the woman, shoving her roughly to the ground. She landed with a pained grunt, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan's fingers tightened on the revolvers. "Thanks," she managed to choke out, looking up at him with gratitude. "Go on," Ethan urged, nodding toward the edge of town. "Just get out of here. There's no telling what trouble they're looking for." She hesitated, glancing back at the two men. But Ethan's steely gaze kept her from moving any further. Finally, she scrambled to her feet and hurried down the dusty street, disappearing around the corner. The two cowboys who had been harassing the woman stood their ground, fists clenched. "You shouldn't have done that, stranger," one of them growled. Ethan didn't reply. He just kept his guns trained on them, his grip steady. The tension in the air was palpable. The saloon doors creaked open, and a few more curious onlookers spilled out into the street. Ethan knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not in this town. "Maybe we should just be going," the other cowboy muttered, nudging his friend. They exchanged a glance, then turned and walked slowly away, heads bowed. Ethan watched them go, his heart still racing, before holstering his guns and turning back to the cowboy who'd been kind enough to loan them to him. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I'd have done without them." The cowboy just shrugged, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to 'em," he drawled. "I reckon I've got enough trouble of my own around here." Ethan considered the offer. After all, he didn't know how long it would take before he found his way home. He needed all the help he could get. With a nod of thanks, he walked back toward the general store, his steps a little lighter than before. He had no idea what he was doing in this world, but at least he knew he had a purpose now. He was going to be a hero, Desolation's own Lone Ranger. Even if it was just for today. The general store was crowded with people, all of them talking in hushed tones about the events that had just unfolded outside the saloon. Ethan heard the whispered comments among them, a mix of awe and fear in their voices. He ignored them, focusing instead on his task at hand. He found the shopkeeper, an older man with a kind face, behind the counter. "Excuse me," Ethan said, trying to sound as confident as possible. "I'm looking for supplies. Ammunition, mostly. I've been told you're the best place in town to find it." The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow, but nodded. That we are, son. Follow me. He led Ethan to the back of the store, to a small room lined with shelves overflowing with boxes of bullets. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. You're the one who took care of those two cowboys out there? The shopkeeper asked, a note of respect in his voice. Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of pride. They spent the next hour loading up Ethan's saddlebags with ammunition of every caliber. The shopkeeper even threw in a few extra revolvers, just in case. As they finished, Ethan paused and looked up at the older man. Thank you, he said. I appreciate your help. The shopkeeper smiled warmly. Don't mention it, son. This town's had its share of heroes over the years, and I think you're going to be one of the best. Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had been accepted, at least by this one man. He nodded gratefully and headed out of the store, ready to face whatever challenges the rest of the day might bring. He mounted his newly acquired horse, checking the saddlebags to make sure everything was secure. The sun was high in the sky now, and the heat of the day was starting to bear down on them. Ethan took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He had a feeling he wasn't going to have much time to rest before trouble found him again. But for now, he was content to ride through the dusty streets of desolation, knowing that he had made a difference. As he rode toward the outskirts of town, he passed by the saloon once more. The two cowboys who had started the trouble earlier were nowhere to be seen. Ethan smiled to himself. Maybe they'd had enough sense to leave town while they still could. Or maybe they were just hiding, biding their time until they found a way to get back at him. Either way, he was ready for them. The thought made him feel invincible. He urged his horse into a gallop, the wind rushing past him, the sound of hooves thundering against the earth. Desolation faded into the distance behind him, replaced by endless stretches of dusty plains and cacti. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by any clouds. It was a perfect day for riding, for being a hero. Ethan rode for hours, following the trail he had been given. The further he went, the more the landscape seemed to change. The plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with the occasional cluster of trees. The air grew cooler, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine. He felt a new sense of determination welling up inside him, fueled by the knowledge that he was truly making a difference. Eventually, he crested a hill and saw it, a small cabin nestled at the base, surrounded by a makeshift fence. He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was it. The cabin belonged to an elderly woman who had been living alone since her husband had been killed by bandits. Ethan had been warned that she might be armed, but he wasn't worried. He had come to protect her, to make sure she didn't suffer the same fate as his parents. He approached the cabin cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman poked her head out. She was small and frail, with gray hair and a wrinkled face. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Hello?" he said, trying to sound reassuring. "My name is Ethan. I've been sent to help you." The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Come in, son," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly neat and tidy, with a small fire crackling in the hearth. Ethan took a seat at the table, his back to the door. "Can I get you anything?" he asked. "Some water, maybe?" The old woman shook her head. "No, thank you, son. I'm fine for now." Her eyes drifted back to the fire, a faraway look in them. "It's been so long since anyone's cared enough to help me. I thought I'd be alone forever." Ethan nodded, understanding her words all too well. "That's why I'm here," he said gently. "To make sure you don't have to face things alone anymore." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "You see, my parents were killed by bandits too. And I swore that I would use everything in my power to stop them from hurting anyone else." The woman's eyes widened at his words, and she reached out a trembling hand to grasp his own. "Thank you, son. Thank you for coming." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the cabin nonetheless. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver through Ethan's spine. He glanced out the window, wondering if the two cowboys had followed him after all. But for now, he had to focus on the woman in front of him. He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry," he said. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Time passed slowly, and Ethan found himself telling the woman about his life, about his dreams for the future. He didn't know why he was sharing these things with her, but it felt right. Perhaps it was because they were both survivors, both trying to find their way in a world that seemed intent on tearing them apart. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the cabin, and outside, the sun began to sink low in the sky. Eventually, the woman leaned back in her chair, a contented smile on her face. "You know," she said, her voice soft and thoughtful, "I think you're going to be just fine. You have a good heart, Ethan. And that's something that can't be taken from you, no matter what happens." Ethan felt a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope I can live up to that." He paused, thinking of the two cowboys who had taken his parents from him, and the countless others who had suffered at their hands. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to make sure no one else has to go through what we've been through." The old woman smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth and wisdom. "I believe you, son," she said softly. "I believe you'll make a difference." She leaned forward and patted his hand gently. "Now, why don't you stay here with me for a while? It's getting cold out there, and I could use the company." Ethan nodded, grateful for the invitation. He moved to add more wood to the fire, casting glances out the window as he did so. It was getting dark now, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the occasional howl that sent shivers down his spine. But he forced himself to focus on the warmth of the fire and the comforting presence of the old woman beside him. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him. He knew that he couldn't stay in this cabin forever, that he had to find a way to bring the bandits to justice and make sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. But for now, he was content to enjoy the moment, to savor the feeling of safety and companionship that came from being with the old woman. Finally, the woman spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember the story I told you earlier? About the brave hero who set out to save the world from the evil villain?" Ethan nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Well," she continued, "I think you're that hero, son. And I'm proud of you." Ethan felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked at the woman who had become like a mother to him in the brief time they'd known each other. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget you." The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn timbers. Outside, the wind howled, the sound of it seeming to echo the pain and loss Ethan felt deep inside. But for now, he was content to be here, surrounded by the warmth and safety of the old woman's presence. "You know," the woman said softly, her eyes fixed on the fire, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Ethan leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" he asked. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "It's about your parents," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were good people, Ethan. Kind and brave. They would be so proud of you right now." Tears trickled down her cheeks as she spoke, and Ethan found himself unable to hold back his own tears any longer. As the night wore on, they talked about their dreams for the future, their hopes for a world where people like the bandits didn't exist. The fire burned low, its embers glowing orange and red, casting a warm light over their faces. And as Ethan looked into the old woman's wise, gentle eyes, he knew that somehow, he would find the strength to make those dreams a reality. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the cabin's tiny windows, Ethan stood up and stretched. "I should be going," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I have to find a way to stop the bandits and bring them to justice." The old woman rose slowly from her chair, her joints creaking in protest. "Be careful, son," she said, placing a gnarled hand on his shoulder. "And remember, you're never alone. As long as you keep your wits about you and your heart true, you'll always have a home here." Ethan nodded, his eyes filling with tears once more. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." They embraced, the old woman's frail frame surprisingly strong as she held Ethan close. For a moment, they simply stood there, locked in an embrace that seemed to convey all the love, hope, and wisdom they had for each other. Then, with a deep breath, Ethan let go, steeling himself for the journey ahead. A pang of loneliness settled in Ethan's chest, the memory of the old woman's warmth a comforting echo. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the simple furniture and the worn rug beside the fireplace. It had been a brief respite, but it had changed him. He wasn't just a programmer lost in a strange world anymore. He was Ethan Carter, the protector, and he had a purpose. Stepping outside, he inhaled the crisp morning air. The forest stretched before him, a dense mass of green punctuated by the occasional sliver of sunlight filtering through the canopy. He adjusted the holster strapped to his hips, the weight of the revolvers a familiar comfort. The old woman had mentioned the bandits' hideout being located deep within the forest, a place known as Deadwood Gulch. It wouldn't be an easy journey, but Ethan was determined. With a resolute nod, he mounted his horse and nudged it forward. The horse, a sturdy chestnut mare, snorted and pawed at the ground before setting off at a steady trot. The forest floor was a maze of tangled roots and fallen leaves, the path barely discernible. But Ethan pressed on, his eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. Hours bled into one another, time passed, as Ethan navigated the labyrinthine forest. The sun climbed its zenith, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor, and then began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, and an unsettling silence descended, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of a lonely bird. Just as doubt began to gnaw at the edges of his determination, Ethan spotted a plume of smoke rising in the distance. His heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. He urged his horse forward, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves the only sound in the deepening gloom. As he emerged from a particularly dense thicket of trees, the sight that greeted him sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. Nestled in a clearing ahead was a ramshackle collection of buildings, a saloon with swinging doors the most prominent among them. Lanterns flickered outside, casting an eerie glow on the dusty street. This had to be Deadwood Gulch. Ethan dismounted, his hand hovering near the holsters on his hips. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. He wasn't sure what awaited him inside, but he knew he couldn't back down now. With a determined glint in his eyes, he tied his horse to a nearby hitching post and began his approach towards the saloon. The creaking of the saloon doors scraped against the silence like fingernails on a chalkboard. Ethan's boots crunched on the gritty wooden floor as he stepped inside. The air hung thick with the smell of stale tobacco and cheap liquor. Several weathered faces turned towards him, their eyes narrowed in suspicion. A single, flickering oil lamp hung from the rough-hewn ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Gamblers hunched over dusty poker tables, their faces obscured by the brim of their hats. A lone piano player hammered out a melancholic tune in the corner, the sound swallowed by the murmur of hushed conversations. Ethan scanned the room, searching for any sign of the bandits. He spotted a burly man hunched over a bar at the far end, his back to Ethan. A shock of recognition jolted him. It was one of the cowboys he'd faced back in Desolation. His heart hammered in his chest. Was he alone here? Or were there others waiting to ambush him? Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached the bar, his hand instinctively gripping the worn leather of the holsters. The bartender, a man with a thick, gray beard and a single gold tooth glinting in the dim light, looked up at him with a bored expression. "What can I get ya, stranger?" he drawled, wiping a glass with a rag that looked more like a weapon than a cleaning tool. "Information," Ethan said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm looking for a group of bandits. They operate out of here, don't they?" The bartender's eyes narrowed further. The room seemed to fall silent, every pair of eyes now fixed on Ethan. He felt the weight of their stares, a tangible threat hanging in the air. "You ain't from around here, are you?" The bartender grunted, his voice laced with suspicion. "Not exactly," Ethan admitted, keeping his guard up. But I have a score to settle. A tense silence followed. Then, the burly man from earlier spun on his barstool, his face contorted in a sneer. It was the cowboy from Desolation. Sounds like you're looking for trouble, stranger. The cowboy snarled, his voice dripping with menace. Trouble? Ethan countered, a steely edge creeping into his voice. I'd call it justice. The room erupted in a cacophony of shouts and jeers. Gamblers shoved back their chairs, reaching for hidden weapons. The piano player stopped his tune, his face twisted in a grimace. Ethan knew he was outnumbered, but fear wouldn't save him now. He reached for his revolvers, his fingers flying over the leather holsters. Before the cowboys could react, he drew them, aiming for the center of the room. The metal glinted in the dim light as a hush fell over the saloon. This ain't a standoff, stranger. The bartender rasped, his hand inching towards a hidden weapon beneath the bar counter. Ethan held his ground. Maybe not, he said, his voice calm despite the rising panic in his chest. But it could be an end. The air crackled with tension. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the blink of an eye. Then, a voice boomed from the shadows at the back of the saloon. Enough! A tall, imposing figure emerged from the darkness. He wore a Stetson hat pulled low over his brow, and a long duster obscured most of his form. 2 revolvers gleamed at his hips, the worn leather testament to their frequent use. The room fell silent once more. This ain't the way we do business here, the stranger rasped, his voice low and gravelly. Either the fella has business with us, or he leaves in peace. Ethan's gaze locked with the newcomer's. He could sense a power about him, a quiet authority that demanded respect. Maybe this wasn't another dead end. Maybe this was a chance. I may have business, Ethan said, his voice firm but not hostile. But not the kind you might be thinking. He lowered his guns, a calculated risk. The room remained tense, but the immediate threat seemed to have subsided. Tell me what you want, stranger, the imposing figure rumbled. And choose your words carefully. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew he needed to be strategic. These weren't mindless thugs, but men with their own code of honor, twisted as it might be. I'm here for information, he said, his voice clear. I'm looking for a group of bandits who operate out of a hidden canyon called Devil's Throat. Ethan finished, his voice echoing slightly in the tense silence. The imposing figure, who the patrons now seemed to address as boss, didn't react immediately. He simply stood there, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat, silently weighing Ethan's words. Finally, a gruff chuckle rumbled from beneath the Stetson. Devil's Throat, huh? Sounds like you've been talking to some interesting folk. His gaze flickered to the bartender, who quickly averted his eyes, wiping down a glass with renewed vigor. Look, stranger, boss continued, his voice surprisingly calm. Information ain't cheap. Especially about something like the Devil's Throat. Those boys are ruthless, and they don't take kindly to snooping. Ethan understood. He wasn't naive enough to believe these men were saints. But they held the key to finding the bandits that plagued the region, and he was desperate. I'm willing to pay, he stated, his hand instinctively reaching for the hidden pouch at his waist where the shopkeeper in Desolation had stashed a hefty sum for his troubles. Boss raised an eyebrow. Gold won't get you far in this town, stranger. Not with something like this. Ethan frowned. What did they want then? He wasn't exactly overflowing with valuables in this strange world. A sudden memory flashed in his mind, the revolvers the shopkeeper had thrown in. Maybe. I have these, he said, reaching into his holsters and pulling out the 2 well-worn revolvers. They're yours if you give me the information I need. A murmur rippled through the room as several patrons gasped. The bartender choked on his spit. Boss, however, remained unfazed. He took the guns from Ethan, inspecting them with a practiced eye. These ain't bad, he conceded, his voice a low rumble. But information on the Devil's Throat is worth more than a couple of second-hand revolvers. Ethan's heart sank. What more could they possibly want? Then Boss leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's a shipment coming in soon. Supplies for the boys in the throat. If you can help us intercept it, the information's yours. Ethan's mind raced. This was a risky proposition. Getting involved in a robbery, even one targeting these bandits, wasn't exactly his idea of heroism. But it was a chance. He met Boss's gaze, a steely resolve forming in his eyes. All right, he said, his voice firm. Let's hear the plan. A slow smile spread across Boss's face beneath the brim of his hat. Welcome to the team, stranger. We could use someone with your gumption. With a newfound purpose coursing through his veins, Ethan settled into a rickety chair at the bar, listening intently as Boss outlined the details of the daring heist. He was no longer just a programmer lost in a strange land. He was Ethan Carter, reluctant outlaw, and his quest for justice had just taken a sharp turn. The shipment was to arrive at a secluded dock on the outskirts of town, guarded by a small group of the Devil's Throat's most trusted enforcers. They would have to move fast and silently, taking out the guards before they could raise the alarm. Once the warehouse was secured, they would need to find the shipment and make their escape. The plan, while risky, had a good chance of success. Boss and his men knew the terrain well, and they had access to weapons and horses that would give them the edge they needed. Ethan would be given a revolver and a horse of his own, as well as instructions on how to use them effectively. As the evening wore on, they went over the details of the heist over and over again, making sure everyone understood their roles. Ethan practiced drawing his revolver from its holster, acing the motion with a practiced ease that surprised even himself. The men around him nodded in approval, giving him a newfound sense of belonging. Finally, the night came to an end, and the group dispersed. Ethan found himself alone at the bar, staring into the bottom of a dusty bottle of whiskey. The weight of his decision hung heavily on his shoulders, but he knew he had to see it through. Tomorrow, he would become a part of something bigger than himself, and perhaps, with any luck, he would find the justice he had been seeking. He paid his tab and left the saloon, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars were beginning to fade from the sky, and the first hints of dawn were starting to creep over the horizon. He mounted his horse, feeling the familiar weight of his revolver at his hip, and rode out of town, following the trail that would lead him to the Devil's Throat. Ethan wasn't aware of how much time passed as he rode, since days bled into months, but the tension in his shoulders slowly began to ease. The rhythm of his horse's hooves against the hard-packed earth was oddly soothing, and the cool morning air filled his lungs with a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years. Despite the gravity of their mission, he couldn't help but feel a thrill coursing through him, a mix of adrenaline and purpose that was as intoxicating as any whiskey he'd ever tasted. The trail wound through rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stunted tree. To his left, the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and pink. To his right, the throat loomed large, a vast network of caves and tunnels carved into the rocky cliffs. He could see the distant flicker of torches burning deep within the caverns, a testament to the bandits' constant activity. As they drew closer, Boss rode up alongside him, his horse's breath misting in the air. "You ready for this, stranger?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard as he tried to steady his nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, forcing a confidence he didn't quite feel. Boss grinned, clapping him on the back before urging his horse to fall back into formation with the others. They rode in silence for several more minutes, until they crested a hill and saw the building below them, lit up by the dim glow of lanterns. A lone figure stood guard at the end of the building, a rifle slung over his shoulder. The shipment, a large wooden crate, was secured by thick ropes. Boss gestured to his men, and they spread out, fanning out around the crate. Ethan found himself in the back, his heart pounding in his ears as he waited for the signal. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity, and then, suddenly, a shout rang out from below. The guard had spotted them. Time seemed to slow down as Ethan drew his revolver, aiming at the guard's chest. His heart pounded in his ears, but his hands were steady. The guard was still fumbling with his rifle, trying to draw it from its sling. It was now or never. Ethan fired, the sound of his gunshot echoing off the surrounding cliffs. The guard crumpled to the ground, his rifle falling from his lifeless hand. For a moment, there was silence, and then the men around him erupted into cheers. Ethan looked over at Boss, who nodded in approval, before turning his attention back to the crate. They worked quickly, cutting the ropes that secured the crate and prying it loose. Ethan found himself at the front of the group, pushing the crate towards the waiting wagons. The shipment was heavy, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins gave him the strength he needed. As they loaded the crate into the wagon, Boss stepped forward, addressing the men. "All right, boys. It's been a long night, but we did it. Let's get this back to town and collect our reward." "Ethan," he said, nodding in Ethan's direction, "you did good work tonight. I think you're going to fit in just fine around here." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the men around him. He couldn't help but wonder if they would have trusted him as much if they knew his true intentions. But for now, he would play along and see where it took him. He mounted his horse and followed the wagons back towards town, the sun beginning to rise over the horizon, bathing the world in a warm, golden light. As they rode, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The men around him seemed too relaxed, almost giddy. It was as if they hadn't just committed a daring robbery and killed an innocent man. But then again, maybe that was just how they did things out here in the West. Maybe Ethan was the one who didn't fit in after all. They reached town a few hours later, the wagons rumbling through the dusty streets. Ethan's heart was racing, his palms sweaty. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The men around him seemed too relaxed, too confident. They didn't seem to realize that their every move was being watched. As they pulled up in front of the saloon, Boss nodded toward a nearby alley. "All right, boys. Let's take the crate around back and store it for now. Ethan, why don't you come with me? I want to talk to you about a little errand I need you to run." Ethan followed Boss into the alley, his steps slow and hesitant. "Look, Ethan," Boss said, leaning against the wooden crate. "I appreciate the work you've done so far, but I think it's time we had a little talk. You see, you're not one of us. These men, they're not good men. They're not men who can be trusted." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "But you, Ethan, you're different. You have a conscience. You care about what's right and wrong." "I don't know what you mean," he stammered. Boss smiled, pushing off the wall. "I think you do. I think you've been playing a dangerous game, pretending to be one of us while all along, you've been planning something else." He paused, taking a step closer to Ethan. "I want you to stop. Leave this life behind. There's still time for you to make a difference. You can go back to your family, start a new life. But if you stay, if you keep playing this game, I can't guarantee your safety or theirs." Ethan swallowed hard, his heart racing. He knew Boss was right. He couldn't keep going down this path. But what would he do now? How could he leave everything behind? He looked at Boss, searching for some answer, some sign that it would be okay. "It's your choice, Ethan," Boss said softly. "But remember, we're not the only ones out here. There are others who would see you as an asset. And they won't be as understanding or as forgiving as I've been." He paused, his expression grim. "If you decide to leave, I'll help you. I'll make sure you get safely back to your family. But once you're gone, I can't protect you anymore." Ethan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay here, couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. He had to go back to his family, to the life he'd left behind. But the thought of leaving them again, of knowing that he'd failed to protect them, it was almost too much to bear. "I'll do it," he stammered. "I'll leave. I'll start over." Boss nodded, his expression softening. "Good man. I knew you'd make the right choice. Now go find a good horse, pack what you can, and meet me at the edge of town by sundown. We'll see you on your way." With that, Boss turned and walked back toward the saloon, leaving Ethan alone in the alley. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe he was really going to do it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and then turned to find a horse and gather his belongings. As he walked, he tried to push away the feeling of guilt and despair that threatened to engulf him. He knew that leaving wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to protect any hope of a future. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. He mounted his horse, turned back to face the town one last time, and then rode away, leaving everything he'd known behind him. The wind whipped at his face, carrying with it the dust of the road and the promise of a new beginning. As the town faded into the distance, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. He was leaving everything behind. He glanced down at his hands, calloused from years of riding and working, and wondered what his future would hold. During his time in the gang, he had married and started a family, and they would be happy to know that he was becoming a better man for them. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and blue. Ethan pulled his duster tighter around him, trying to ward off the chill that crept into his bones. He knew that it would take time to adjust to life outside of the gang, to find his place in the world again. But he was determined to make a fresh start, to become the man his family deserved. As he rode, he found himself thinking about his wife, Emily, and their 2 young children. He couldn't wait to see their faces when he finally arrived home, to tell them that he was truly free and that they would never have to worry about him again. He imagined the laughter and the joy that would fill their small, cozy house. It was a vision that kept him going, that gave him the strength to keep riding even when his body ached and his spirit grew weary. The hours passed, and Ethan found himself deep in thought. He replayed the final conversation with Boss over and over in his mind, trying to understand the man's motives, wondering if he had made the right choice. But each time, he came to the same conclusion. He had done the right thing. He had protected his family, and for that, he couldn't ask for anything more. As the night sky gave way to the first hints of dawn, Ethan finally spied the familiar outline of his small, temporary home. A bandit didn't exactly have the luxury of a permanent home, but Emily had always stuck by him and understood the need to leave at a moment's notice. His heart leapt with joy, and he urged his horse into a gallop. The wind rushed past him, whistling through his hair, as he raced toward the place where he belonged. Emily stood in the doorway, her face lit up with tears of happiness and relief, and Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He dismounted quickly, throwing his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder. She held him tightly, her hands running through his hair, and he could feel the tremors of her sobs. "I'm home," he whispered. "I'm really home." Behind them, their 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, clamored to see their father. They wrapped their small arms around his legs, their faces alight with joy and wonder. Ethan looked down at them, feeling a sense of awe and pride wash over him. He had done it. He had escaped from the gang, protected his family, and made it back home. As he held them close, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But in this moment, as they stood together under the sun, he couldn't imagine wanting anything more. He led his horse around back to the stable, grateful for the familiar routine. As he worked, he glanced up at his family, watching them from the corner of his eye. Emily had taken the children inside, and they could be heard laughing and playing in the background. It was a sound that filled Ethan with a sense of contentment and peace. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that he had everything he needed right here. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the small house, Ethan sat down on the stable's old wooden bench. He leaned back against the wall, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and closed his eyes. He could hear the soft murmur of his family inside the house, and it was the sweetest music he had ever heard. He knew that this was home, that this was where he belonged. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the day he had first met Emily, at a church picnic. They had talked throughout the day, laughing and walking through the grass. It seemed like only yesterday, and now they were parents themselves. He wondered what kind of life they would be able to provide for their children, knowing that the world was not always a kind place. But he also knew that they could face anything together, as long as they had each other. He stood up, stretching his tired muscles, and made his way back into the house. The smell of breakfast filled the air, and his stomach rumbled in anticipation. Emily looked up from where she was chopping vegetables at the kitchen counter and smiled at him. "You're home," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're finally home." Ethan crossed the room and took her in his arms, holding her tightly, feeling the strength and resilience that she possessed. "I'm home," he replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I'm never leaving again." They stood there for a moment, lost in each other's eyes, before releasing one another and turning back to their tasks. The children ran into the kitchen, their faces alight with excitement and curiosity. "Did you see Daddy?" they asked in unison, bouncing up and down on their tiny feet. Ethan knelt down so that he was at their eye level, and smiled at them. "I'm right here," he said, ruffling their hair. "I'm never leaving you again." And as he said those words, he knew in his heart that they were true. He had made a choice to protect his family and keep them safe, no matter what. In that moment, he felt invincible, as if nothing could ever tear them apart again. They sat down at the kitchen table, Emily and the children chattering away about their day, laughing and sharing stories. Ethan listened, his gaze drifting out the window as he took in the familiar sight of their small home. Despite the challenges they had faced, it still felt like home. It was a sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves and find comfort in each other's company. As they ate their breakfast, the sun continued to rise, bathing the countryside in a warm, golden light. Ethan couldn't help but feel grateful for this moment, for the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with the people he loved most in the world. In the background, he could hear the sound of birds singing, and the gentle rustle of the leaves as the wind picked up. It was a peaceful, idyllic scene, one that seemed almost too perfect to be real. After breakfast, they cleaned up the kitchen together, laughing and joking as they worked. Ethan felt a sense of contentment wash over him, a deep-seated knowledge that this was where he belonged. He might not have everything he'd ever wanted in life, but he had something far more important, a family who loved him, and who depended on him for their safety and well-being. As the morning wore on, they found small tasks to occupy themselves with. Emily tended to the garden, while the children played with their toys in the yard. Ethan cleaned up the stable, making sure that everything was in order for the day ahead. The air was filled with the scent of spring, and the promise of new beginnings. Later in the afternoon, they would head into town to see the mayor and inform him of their decision to stay. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were prepared to face whatever challenges came their way. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. As Ethan worked in the stable, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the life they had built together. Yes, it was simple, but it was honest and real. They didn't have much in the way of material possessions, but they had love, and they had each other. That was something that no one could ever take away from them. Emily appeared in the stable doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "The children are getting restless," she said with a smile. "They keep asking when we're going to see Daddy again." Ethan grinned back at her, feeling the weight of his newfound purpose settle comfortably on his shoulders. "Not long now," he replied, tossing a brush to her. "Why don't you take them into town early? I'll finish up here and join you shortly." Emily nodded and turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at him with a thoughtful expression. "Are you sure you want to do this, Ethan?" she asked quietly. "You know this won't be easy for any of us." He met her gaze steadily, feeling the resolve within him grow even stronger. "I'm more sure of this than I've ever been of anything," he said, his voice firm. "We're a family, and we stick together. No matter what." With that, she turned and went back to their children, giving him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder as she passed. Ethan watched her go, feeling a surge of love and admiration for the woman who had chosen to share her life with him. They had built something beautiful together, and he was determined to protect it with everything he had. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the countryside, Ethan finished up his work in the stable and joined his family outside. Emily was helping the children into their coats, her movements a careful dance of efficiency and tenderness. They all looked up as he approached, their faces lit with excitement and anticipation. "Are we ready to go see the mayor?" Ethan asked, his voice full of determination. The children nodded eagerly, their eyes shining with hope. Emily took a deep breath, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed her small family. She reached out and took Ethan's hand, squeezing it gently. "We can do this," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." He smiled down at her, feeling a surge of love and gratitude assailants. They set off towards town, the children chattering excitedly about the sights they might see and the people they might meet. As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in their little family, and a fierce determination to protect them at all costs. The walk to the mayor's office seemed to take forever, but eventually they arrived, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The mayor himself was a portly man with a bushy mustache and a kindly smile. He ushered them into his office, offering them seats around a large oak desk. "So," he began, leaning back in his chair, "I understand you've made a decision about your future." His eyes flickered between them, assessing their expressions. "Tell me, what has brought about this change of heart?" Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "It's not just me, sir," he began. "It's my wife and children, too. We've been discussing it, and we all agree that this is where we belong. We want to make a life for ourselves here, in this town." Emily nodded in agreement, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "We've fallen in love with this place, and with all of you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We want to be a part of it, to raise our children here, to contribute to its well-being however we can." The mayor leaned forward, his gaze intent. "And you understand that this isn't an easy decision for me?" he asked gently. "I have responsibilities to my people, and I must weigh the risks of allowing an outsider into our midst." Ethan reached across the desk, laying a reassuring hand on the older man's arm. "We understand that, sir," he said. "We're not asking for charity, or for anyone to take us in against their will. All we want is the chance to prove ourselves, to show you what we can do for your town." The mayor sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers together as he considered their words. After a long moment of silence, he looked up at them, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Very well," he said. "I see no reason to stand in the way of love and the desire for a better life. You may stay on one condition." Their hearts leapt in unison, hope blossoming anew within them. "What is it, sir?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. "Anything." The mayor's kind eyes crinkled with amusement. "Very well, then. As long as you understand that this is not a permanent arrangement. For the time being, you and your family will have a place to live here in town. I'll speak with the town elders, and we'll find you employment where we can. But in the end, your success or failure will be up to you." Emily and Ethan exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. They both knew that this was no easy task they had set for themselves, but they were ready to face the challenges head-on. "Thank you, sir," Emily said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We won't disappoint you." The mayor nodded, his face solemn. "I have no doubt that you won't," he replied. "Now I'll have my secretary draw up the paperwork. Once it's done, you'll be free to return to your new home." As the mayor rose from his seat, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and gratitude wash over him. They had done it. They had been given a chance to start anew, to make a life for themselves and their children in this strange and wonderful place. And they were going to make the most of it. They followed the secretary out of the office, their steps lighter than they had been in years. As they made their way through the halls of the town hall, they couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the building, the care that had been taken in its construction. It was a testament to the strength and resilience of the people who called this place home, and Ethan knew that they were going to do everything in their power to become a part of that community. Finally, they reached their new home, a small but cozy cottage on the outskirts of town. As they unlocked the door and stepped inside, the children ran ahead, exploring their new bedrooms and marveling at the colorful curtains and soft blankets. Emily and Ethan exchanged a knowing glance, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They knew that this was only the beginning, that the real challenges lay ahead. But they were ready. They spent the rest of the day unpacking their belongings and making the house feel like home. As they worked together, they couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect growing between them. It was clear that they would need each other's strength and support to navigate the unfamiliar customs and expectations of this new town. The next day, they rose early and dressed in their best clothes, eager to begin their new lives. The children, still a bit groggy from the excitement of the previous day, were dressed in their school uniforms and bundled off to class. Emily and Ethan, on the other hand, had more pressing matters to attend to. They had heard through the grapevine that the town hall was hiring, and they were determined to find employment that would allow them to contribute to their new community. They made their way through the quiet streets, admiring the well-kept houses and the neatly trimmed hedges. The air was crisp and clean, and the sun shone brightly in the cloudless sky. It was hard not to feel a sense of optimism as they approached the familiar building where they had met with the mayor only yesterday. Inside, they were directed to the employment office, where they found a long line of people waiting to speak with the town's officials. They took their place at the end of the line, exchanging nervous glances as they waited for their turn. The hours seemed to crawl by, but finally, it was their turn to meet with the employment officer. He was an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile, and he seemed genuinely pleased to meet them. After listening to their skills and experience, he directed them to speak with the head librarian. Emily and Ethan exchanged relieved glances, grateful for the opportunity to work in a field that they were both passionate about. The head librarian, a stern but fair-minded woman named Miss Potts, listened intently as they explained their qualifications. She nodded thoughtfully, her wrinkled face betraying a hint of sympathy for their situation. After considering their application for several minutes, she stood up and gestured for them to follow her into her office. Once inside, she shut the door and leaned against her desk, studying them carefully. "I've gone over your resumes," she began, "and I must say, you both seem like excellent candidates for the positions we have available. However, I'm afraid we only have enough funding to hire one of you." Emily and Ethan exchanged anxious glances. They had both been hoping for a chance to work together, but they understood the financial constraints of the library. "We're prepared to work as a team," Emily said, trying to reassure Ms. Potts. "Either of us could easily handle any task you might assign to the both of us." Ms. Potts considered this for a moment before nodding. "I see. Well, in that case, I believe I have the perfect solution. We have been in need of someone to spearhead a new adult literacy program. It's a project that requires someone with strong organizational skills, experience working with diverse groups of people, and a passion for teaching." She paused, fixing her gaze on Emily. "I believe you'd be perfect for the job." Emily felt a surge of pride and excitement at the prospect of leading such an important initiative. "Thank you, Miss Potts," she said gratefully. "I'm honored, and I promise to do my best to make the program a success." Miss Potts smiled warmly. "I'm sure you will. And as for your husband, Ethan, I think he would be an excellent fit for our children's programming. He has a natural rapport with kids, and his creativity would be an asset to our summer reading program." Ethan grinned, his eyes shining with pride. "Thank you, Miss Potts. I'm honored to be considered." The librarian nodded in agreement. "Excellent. I'll go ahead and discuss your applications, and we'll be in touch soon with our final decision. In the meantime, I want to thank you both for your interest in joining our team. We're looking forward to having you on board." As they left the office, Emily and Ethan exchanged excited glances. Despite the uncertainty of the situation, they felt a sense of optimism and purpose that they hadn't experienced in a long time. The library had given them a chance to use their skills and passions to make a difference in their new community, and they were determined to make the most of it. Over the next few weeks, they threw themselves into their new roles with enthusiasm. Emily worked tirelessly to organize the adult literacy program, designing lesson plans and reaching out to local businesses for support. She also spent time getting to know the other members of the staff, forming friendships that went beyond the workplace. As for Ethan, he quickly became a favorite among the children who attended the summer reading program. His lively storytelling and interactive activities kept them engaged and excited about reading, and he formed strong bonds with many of the kids and their families. As the days turned into weeks, Emily and Ethan found themselves looking forward to coming to work each day. They felt valued and appreciated by their new colleagues, and they were proud of the positive impact they were having on the lives of the people around them. One afternoon, as they were taking a break in the library's small garden, they found themselves reflecting on how far they had come since arriving in town. "I can't believe it's only been a few months," Emily said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I feel like we've made such a difference here." Ethan nodded in agreement. "It's true. And I think it's because we've been able to use our talents and passions to make a real impact. It's not just about finding a job, it's about finding a purpose." As they continued to talk, they were interrupted by the sound of excited giggles coming from the children's section. They both looked up to see a group of kids gathered around a table, their faces lit up with joy as their son, Robbie, helped them with a craft project. Seeing the look of pure happiness on their son's face filled Emily with a sense of pride and gratitude. "I think we're going to be okay, you know," she said quietly to Ethan. "No matter what happens next, we'll find a way to make it work. We have each other, and we have this amazing community here." Ethan reached out to take her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "I know," he said with a smile. "I feel it too. And I'm glad we decided to take this leap of faith together." As they continued to sit in the garden, watching their son and the other children laughing and playing, they knew that they had made the right choice. They had found their new home in this small town, surrounded by people who appreciated them for who they were and valued their contributions. And for now, that was enough. The library had become more than just a place where they went to work. It was their sanctuary, their refuge from the uncertainty of the outside world. They had found a community that embraced them, challenged them, and made them feel like they truly belong. The days passed, and with each one came new experiences and opportunities for growth. Emily and Ethan continued to pour their hearts into their work, inspired by the people they served and the lives they touched. They began to explore the surrounding area, discovering the beauty of the countryside and the rich history of the town. As the summer came to an end and the children returned to school, they found themselves looking forward to the next chapter of their lives here. They had made a home for themselves and each other, and they knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead together. The fall brought with it a new round of applications for grants and funding, and the library continued to thrive under their leadership. They had proven themselves to be dedicated and innovative, always searching for ways to improve their programs and better serve their community. The next week, they decided to take a risk and applied for a grant to expand the library's services even further. They had a vision of a library that was not only a place for books, but also a hub for art, music, and technology. They wanted to create a space where people of all ages could come together and learn, grow, and be inspired. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. They faced challenges and setbacks, but they also celebrated successes and watched as their vision for the library continued to unfold. They had built something truly special together, and they knew that it would only continue to grow and thrive. As they sat on a bench outside the library one sunny afternoon, watching children laughing and playing in the park, Emily took Ethan's hand in hers. "Do you remember when we first arrived here?" she asked him. "When we didn't know anyone and we had no idea what the future held?" Ethan looked into her eyes and smiled. "Yes, I remember. It seems like a lifetime ago now." He leaned in closer and kissed her softly on the cheek. "I'm glad we took that leap of faith together. I'm glad we found each other." She returned his smile, feeling the warmth of his touch spread throughout her body. "Me too," she said, squeezing his hand. "Me too." The years passed, and they never left the library. They continued to grow together, building their life around their shared passion for books and the people they served. They traveled the world, attending conferences and workshops, always seeking to expand their knowledge and bring new ideas back to their beloved library. One day, as they were walking home from the library, arm in arm as they always did, they passed by a little bookstore that was closing its doors. The owner, an elderly woman with a kind face and a sparkle in her eye, saw them and waved them over. "I've been meaning to tell you," she said, her voice soft and trembling with emotion. "You two have done more for this town than anyone I know. You've given these children a place to dream, and you've given us all a reason to believe in the future." Emily and Ethan exchanged a look, tears welling up in their eyes. They hadn't realized the impact they had made, but it was clear that their work had meant something to someone. They continued to walk, hand in hand, their hearts full of gratitude and love for each other, their community, and the little library that had brought them together. The years passed, and their love only deepened. They never lost sight of the importance of the library in their lives, and they made sure that their children understood it as well. As they grew older, they knew that one day they would have to step aside and let someone else take the reins. But they also knew that the library would always be their home, and that the memories they had made there would stay with them forever. They had built something truly special, and it would continue to thrive long after they were gone. On their 50th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the front porch of their cozy house, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Emily leaned over and kissed Ethan on the cheek. "Do you remember when we first started all of this?" He smiled, his eyes twinkling with memories. "Of course I do. It feels like just yesterday we were two young, idealistic kids with a dream of building a library." She laughed softly. "It's incredible how far we've come. We've built more than just a library, we've built a community. And our family? They're the most incredible part of it all." They spent the rest of the afternoon reminiscing about the past, sharing stories and laughter, and marveling at how their little library had become such an integral part of the town's identity. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood, they held hands, content in the knowledge that they had made a difference, together. Their children, now grown with families of their own, would often come by to visit, bringing their own children to see the library where it all began. They would tell stories about their parents, about the library, and about how it had shaped their lives. The library continued to thrive, adapting to the changing times while remaining true to its core mission of fostering a love of learning and community. As Emily and Ethan grew older, they took on more of a mentorship role, guiding the new generations of librarians and volunteers, passing on the wisdom and experience they had gained over the years. They remained active in the library, always eager to share their stories and inspire others to continue their work. On the eve of their 75th anniversary, as they sat together in their favorite reading nook, surrounded by books and the memories they had made, Emily looked up at Ethan and smiled. "I can't imagine having done any of this without you." He returned her smile, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Neither can I, my dear. Neither can I." And they sat there, content in the knowledge that their lives had been defined by a love that was as enduring as the library they had built together. As they continued to talk, they found themselves reminiscing about the early days once more, marveling at how far they had come and how much they had achieved. They spoke of the challenges they had faced, the triumphs they had shared, and the countless lives that had been touched by their work. Then, as abruptly as it began, Ethan found himself back in the server room, the stench of stale air assaulting his nostrils. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the familiar whine of the hard drives filled his ears. Mr. Elm's voice, sharp and demanding, echoed through the room. A wave of nausea washed over Ethan. It had been a dream. All of it. The charming town, the welcoming mayor, the cozy cottage a figment of his sleep-deprived mind. His gaze darted to the picture frame on his desk, a cruel reminder of reality. It held a picture of him, alone, at a beach years ago, the forced smile failing to hide the loneliness in his eyes. A wave of despair crashed over him. His heart ached for a life that never existed, for a family he never had. Emily's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the joy of seeing his children explore the library, all phantoms of his subconscious. The silence of his cubicle echoed the emptiness inside him. He stared at the monotonous spreadsheet on his computer screen, the numbers blurring before his eyes. The dullness of his job, the soul-crushing routine, felt unbearable in the harsh light of reality. Yet, the dream had awakened something within him, a yearning for connection, for purpose. He couldn't just go back to being a cog in the machine. This wasn't the life he wanted anymore. The dream, the simple pleasures he'd experienced, resonated deep within him. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of the life he'd once craved, a life filled with connection and meaning, not the pursuit of a corner office and a bigger paycheck. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. That dream, so vivid and real, wouldn't be ignored. It was a sign, a spark of something bigger. Maybe it wasn't a life in a quaint town, but it was a push in the right direction. He started small. He joined an online book club, rekindling his love of reading. He volunteered at a local community center, helping children with their homework. Slowly, he began building a network, connecting with people who shared his passion for learning and helping others. The dream, though painful in its fleeting nature, became a guiding light. It fueled his determination to build a life with meaning, a life that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he wouldn't let the dream die. He would carry the warmth of Emily's smile, the laughter of his pretend children, and the spirit of community he felt in the dream, forever etched in his heart. It was a reminder of what truly mattered, and a promise to himself to create a life that, even if not a replica of the dream, would be a life worth living. Months turned into a year, and Ethan's life pulsed with a newfound rhythm. The book club discussions sparked lively debates, and the children at the community center blossomed under his gentle guidance. He even started writing again, pouring his experiences and the lingering emotions of his dream into short stories. One crisp autumn afternoon, volunteering at a local book fair, Ethan found himself captivated by a woman browsing the poetry section. Her fiery red hair, cascading down her shoulders, seemed to catch the sunlight, and her eyes held a depth that sent a jolt through him. It was Emily, not the dream Emily exactly, but a real-life version with a sprinkle of freckles across her nose and a smile that held a hint of mischief. Their encounter mirrored the one in his dream. He fumbled with a book, their hands brushed, and their eyes met. A blush crept up her cheeks, mirroring his own. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice like a melody. "I didn't see you there." Ethan recovered first, mustering a smile. "No worries, it happens. Beautiful poetry collection, by the way." They fell into conversation, drawn in by a shared love of literature. He learned her name was Emily, a librarian with a passion for promoting local authors. The connection was undeniable, a spark that reignited the embers of hope he'd nurtured since the dream. Over the next few weeks, their paths kept crossing: a chance encounter at a coffee shop, a lively debate at the book club, a volunteer's shift at the community center. Ethan discovered a different Emily, with her own quirks and dreams. She was fiercely independent, a champion for underrepresented voices in literature, and possessed a contagious enthusiasm for life. One evening, at a local poetry slam, Ethan found himself captivated by Emily's performance. Her words, raw and honest, resonated with his own yearning for a life of meaning. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, and as their eyes met across the dimly lit room, a silent understanding passed between them. Later that night, walking her home under a sky dusted with stars, Ethan found the courage to confess the dream. He spoke hesitantly, unsure of how she would react. But to his surprise, Emily listened intently, her eyes wide with wonder. "It sounds like a beautiful dream," she said when he finished, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Maybe it wasn't a premonition, but a seed planted in your heart. A nudge in the right direction." Ethan looked into her eyes, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Maybe she was right. Maybe the dream wasn't a life he could fully replicate, but it had shown him the path he craved. A path towards connection, purpose, and a love that felt real, even if it wasn't a perfect replica of his dream. As they reached her doorstep, the air crackled with unspoken emotions. Ethan leaned in, his heart pounding, and stole a kiss. It was tentative at first, then deepened, a spark igniting between them that felt both familiar and new. Pulling away, breathless, Emily smiled. "Maybe," she whispered, "we can write our own story together. A story with chapters yet to be written." Ethan's heart soared. The dream might have been a fantasy, but with Emily by his side, he was wide awake, ready to write a new chapter, a chapter filled with the promise of love, purpose, and a future brighter than any he could have ever dreamt. The kiss lingered, a promise whispered on the cool autumn air. As they pulled away, Ethan couldn't help but notice a flicker of something familiar in Emily's eyes, a spark that mirrored the Emily of his dream. Maybe it was the way the streetlight caught her hair, or the warmth in her smile, but for a fleeting moment, the lines between dream and reality blurred. "So," Emily said, breaking the silence, "how about we grab coffee sometime and write the first chapter of this story together?" Ethan grinned, a warmth spreading through him. "I'd like that very much," he replied, his voice filled with a newfound optimism. Maybe the dream wouldn't be replicated perfectly, but with Emily by his side, he was ready to build a life filled with love, laughter, and a shared passion for creating something beautiful together. As they said their goodbyes, a sense of possibility hung heavy in the air. The future stretched before them, an open book waiting to be filled with their own stories, their own laughter, their own version of happily ever after. And who knew, maybe, just maybe, it would turn out to be even better than the dream. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing to stay updated with our latest stories, give us a like if you want to see more, and drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts.